Yeah, I think there's a huge thing. Like what you're saying resonates with me completely around trust. Because nowadays people can't even, people can't trust anything. People can't trust facts on the news. Everyone has their own set of facts. So hearing it from other people, hearing your facts from people you trust, those are the actual facts. Hearing it from your trusted news source, those are your facts, right? Everything has become like, there's just this deficit of trust in so many things.
Aloha, and welcome to another episode of the Groundswell Marketing Podcast, where I connect you to outstanding humans and sustainable ideas. Today, we have Yousuf Bhaijee. He's someone who I stumbled across an incredible article in Reforge around the word-of-mouth coefficient. And it was just a really brilliant breakdown and really helped me conceptualize that you can actually mathematically anticipate and visualize what it takes to actually create word of mouth. So we kind of go into how he created this coefficient and some of the new things that he's working on as well. I think this is one of those individuals that maybe haven't heard of him, but I think you will very much so in the future. I just love these nerding out on some of these really great marketing equations and insights, and this is going to be a really great episode. So get your pens out, and without further ado, let's paddle in. Welcome to the show, Yousuf.
Nice to meet you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So everyone's listening. I tracked him down. I read this really I'm sure he's thinking I'm just like out of the blue. This guy just reaches out to him, and I'm just like curious as heck about this article. He wrote this really incredible article that just caught my full attention on a site that I like to follow called Reforge, and he's an author there, and it's called "How to Calculate Your Word of Mouth Coefficient." And I seriously was just blown away. So we're going to talk about word of mouth, but before we dive into this topic specifically, let's give everyone a little background about yourself. Like, how did you become so heavily into growth, and what led up to creating this article?
Yeah, so my story in growth is I kind of stumbled into it about 10 years ago. I started my career in management consulting at Bain, and after that was looking to figure out what I was going to do. So I ended up at a startup, and I joined the startup world in sort of the jack of all trades roles. A lot of people call it business development. And it was for a company called Tapulous, which was really early into mobile gaming. It was like the first big mobile gaming franchise before there were mobile gaming franchises. And it was 40-person team, kind of did everything from like analytical stuff to marketing to ad sales, you name it, even some product work. And we got acquired by Disney. We became Disney Mobile, and some big shifts happened in the mobile ecosystem, where all of a sudden user acquisition became the hardest and biggest problem, and just a bottleneck for all these mobile app developers. So they said, "Hey, we know you've been kind of doing this as 10% of your time. Can you come in? And we're getting rid of the marketing team. Can you and someone else build it back out?" I said, "Sure. That sounds really exciting." And that was my first foray into growth before there was really growth. I think at that point, it was just called user acquisition. Mm-hmm. So I joined, built out the mobile user acquisition machine at Disney Mobile. And then I sort of started doing it for other parts of Disney, like Disney Channel and ABC. I got bored of that, went to Zynga, did some similar stuff where they said, "Hey, here's a big problem. We don't know what to do. We got to grow our user base. Can you figure out how?" And that has sort of been my career. That experience at Zynga led to the beginnings of this word of mouth work. Now, most recently, I've been in a number of places. Most recently, I was at a startup called Ease, which was the largest cannabis delivery startup in California. I was there for about 3 years as a VP of growth. And now I've left, spending part of my time writing, part of my time advising. And that's kind of where this word of mouth coefficient article came from. It was the first article I wrote when I said I'm going to start writing about some of my past experiences.
Well, this was the first article you wrote?
Yeah. First
Are you
article.
kidding me?
The first article is always the
I did
hardest
not know
to
that.
get out.
Dude, your first article is epic. You have a very amazing trajectory. You have my first article was so janky, it's not funny. So okay, that's pretty cool. Can I ask you a question? Like when you said there was like in your former career that there was user acquisition just suddenly became very difficult. What was the shift, or was it just some like what was the reason for that?
So this was 2010, and like to set the stage, 2010 in mobile gaming, it's around the time of the iPhone 3, iPhone 3S. This is when people's moms are getting their first iPhone. So you have this massive migration of users spending their time on desktop to now spending it on this new device, mobile, spending all their time. And so that's where people are spending their time, and they're downloading apps. But really the only way they were discovering apps was by scrolling the top free charts. So people would scroll the top 25, and literally like 80% of all discovery would happen that way. So what companies had done is they had, very, very few, including us, is we figured out, kind of pieced out how the algorithm was working for ranking where your app shows up in the top 200. And we figured out a way to acquire users in paid acquisition with just the right amount so that we would shoot up to the top of the charts. And by doing that, we would just get millions of quote unquote free installs. So I think at Disney Mobile, we drove like 100 million free downloads of our games through that. Now, like why that changed? That changed because Apple said, hey, we're going to change our algorithm because people are doing things. They're acquiring users that aren't valuable just so that they can fly up the charts. And it made the cost per acquisition of a mobile app go from like a quarter to like $1.50.
That's a big jump.
Now it's a big jump, but what's most important is most developers at that time, their apps or their games were monetizing at like 50 cents to $1. So there was no arbitrage opportunity because you're paying more than you're making back in the game. And so that's where it's like, okay, how do we figure out, how do we continue changing our strategy for app store optimization, like, with the algorithm and ranking, as well as figuring out like now, how do we acquire users not using the algorithm, not being reliant on just the app store and doing like traditional paid acquisition marketing through ad networks and display ads.
Don't you find that exhausting, like chasing the algorithm that it's in it and it changes, and just when you think you got to figure out the algorithm changes, you're just like, it just throws off your business, like it's out of your control. That's just got to be infuriating.
It's interesting. It's actually really interesting, and I look at it as more broadly the history of the internet. So if you think of like SEO, search engine optimization, that's all that is people trying to figure out the algorithm, chasing it, and then it changed. It's this constant game of like cat and mouse. This was that if you're early to figure it out, you can drive 100 million installs, but it's not going to last at the end of the day. That's actually what started making me interested in the word of mouth stuff, which
that's
I don't believe it's a hack.
See, now you segued exactly what I was hoping you were going to say, because I stopped chasing this algorithm nonsense that most of people in marketing, my peers were, and I just went, you know what? I'm exhausted. It's like whack-a-mole of trying to chase the algorithm. I'm like, there's got to be a more sustainable way to do this. And I'm like, when good old-fashioned word of mouth is like core to it. And so I'm always on the hunt for like any sort of sustainable growth marketing strategies that exist. So you're telling me that that's how Web was born. I want to hear more about this. This is very interesting. So what was the bridge? Like what were you just going, like, were you tired of it? Or are you just going, I found a better way? Or you were just trying to have multiple channels? Like what?
It was a bit of a slow realization. One, just learning that like things go away, is that the first implication is you can't be reliant on one channel. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is these quote unquote hacks, they last for a certain amount of time, but they're lasting for shorter and shorter periods of time.
Yeah.
It's getting more competitive. There's a lot of people who are fast following. And so it's not really a good way to build like sustainable growth. And so those are things that are kind of happening in parallel. It wasn't like one set moment where I'm like, I'm done with this. But it had me start looking and realizing that, like, look, there's still a lot of value. If you're like a Zynga and you can figure out on Facebook how to get people to use all the viral channels, and like you get Farmville downloaded by 1 billion people, 1 out of 6 people in the world have played Farmville. Like, that's great. You should still do that, but that can't be your sole focus, right? You got to figure out what these long-term non-hack strategies are.
Yeah,
And
so it's not
like a
foundational.
slow.
Yeah, it's like you can add on top of it, and it's like it's a bonus as opposed to
Yeah.
your primary objective, primary strategy. Sorry.
Yeah. So I've tried to move away and move towards that, but still with the overarching idea of like what excites me about growth is that it's always changing. And if you are the first one to figure stuff out, then you can realize like outsized gains, outside results versus anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And this word of mouth for me represents that, but in a more of a sustainable way. It's not a hack. It's being first one to realize here's how you can measure word of mouth and then working on it. I decided actually though that I don't want this to be just a proprietary secret. Did this research and then now have put it out there as kind of like open source for everyone. Mm-hmm. We just released the second article where all the tools I built, I released those tools. So you can go and download the actual analyses and actual tools so you can calculate this yourself for your own product, for your own company.
And they'll be totally in the show notes. I'm going to add them in the show notes there. So we're going to dive into this article in detail. But first, you had a really interesting comment, which is the definition of growth has changed, and and what it is has changed. And growth, and you were into it before it was growth. Like I remember, growth became a thing, and then now everybody's going, oh, it's all about growth. And it's so funny how these things sort of trend and move. And now it's almost where I feel, anyways, where if you say you're in growth and all you are is about growth, it's almost implies that there's this it's a single discipline, and it's really that's it. It's all about growth, but there's so many other factors that come into really successfully maintaining your business, growing your business, and making it sustainable. I'm just curious what your experience has been, because you've been right into it, seen the change, and where is it going now? Like, where do you see growth as it is right now? Is growth just going to basically go away as a term? Is it important? Like, tell me about what you think growth is about.
I see it as it's at a moment where it needs to be reinvented, and it kind of is. So thinking about going back to 2010, when we became Disney and I started doing this thing that like 5 people knew how to do. You had other people who were doing advertising for mobile games. So all these different groups at Disney they hired agencies, but they didn't know how to do it. So they started firing all those agencies and telling me to do it for them. Then you have a bunch of people learning and following, and eventually growth became synonymous with paid acquisition. And it now needs to be reinvented, because now paid acquisition is a bit of a commodity. The algorithms actually do half the work for you. And because of that, right, growth, typically you hire growth people and there's a premium for growth people because they figure new stuff out. But it's at a moment where like, okay, everyone knows how to do what used to be growth. And my bet is that currently it's going to be more along product-led growth, which is what Reforge is all about, as well as experimentation. And what I think word of mouth too is going to become a big thing.
So tell me about product. Let's break that down for people so they're listening and going, well, what does that mean by product growth?
Yeah, so there's the idea is product-led growth. It's you're not doing marketing isn't what's driving growth of the product. It's the product itself. So it's the product features. Mm-hmm. So I think you have like a couple interesting examples. I think a really popular one is Dropbox. So Dropbox grew by people inviting other people. Like the product was designed that you want to invite other people because you want to share files with them and access to it. So just by the design of it, by sharing, other people would start using the service. And it was just this like cycle. Pinterest is another great one. I don't know if they ever did any paid acquisition. I don't know if they've ever done any paid acquisition. I do know that they had only hired, this company has been around a long time. It's now a public company. I think they only hired their first CMO ever, like a few months before they went public. Like it's in the last year or so was the first time they had a CMO. Their entire company was driven by a growth team who built product features that, led people to increase how often they pinned. And the more they pinned, the better they ranked in Google's algorithms, and for more terms. And thus it was just this cycle. And that's the idea behind product-led growth, is you design the product in the sort that creates like loops which compound on each other and drive more users.
Yeah, it's like almost being a growth architect is that whole discipline there, working with product design and your operational and finding a way to make it attractive to kind of like create that loop.
Exactly.
I think that right there is like where so many, best marketing is when you don't have to market. So that's basically what you're doing, right? Like, but someone's still going to go, well, you still need to get people to start, you still need to get like your initial user base. But it's like, I think it's like a compounding, dime, it's like it gets into a lot of money pretty quick. After about, I think 16 doubles, it turns into a lot of money. So I think that's what the product size comes from. So then you mentioned the other one, which is what? There was three, I think you just said there.
I think it's experimentation.
Oh, experimentation, right.
Experimentation, and I think this is coupled. I'd say experimentation / data. I think those two are coupled together. So I've noticed this both on the product and on the marketing side, is people will do stuff, but they won't always like test it. They won't test it to make sure it actually uplifts a metric. So they're just doing stuff to do stuff. But if you have this rigorous process of experimentation, you're always doing things and testing things and releasing things that are additive, like add growth to it. That's one part of it. The other part is a lot of these companies end up with a ton of like data, and using that data, they can create like customized, personalized experiments, which actually increases retention, increases virality, increases acquisition. And that's a good bridge, because that's kind of where we are right now, where there's a lot of improvements or a lot of people investing in data science, but not that many people connecting the two really. And that's where I see it going.
Like the data science and the experimentation, which is pretty much like it's right brain, right? Like it's really like analytical and so forth. But the testing is what I like about it, is it can include a bit of that sort of art, the little bit of the creative, because you can test creative combined with what your data is telling you, and it gives you just a different flavor. I think that's where people can go so far, in my opinion, in the data, and they just rely on it too much, when the reality is the real magic is sort of this sort of like alchemy of art and science together a little bit. And then the only way to verify it is through these testing mechanisms, right?
Yeah, completely.
How much do you think creative plays a role in some of the growth opportunities?
I think on the paid acquisition side now, it used to be weighted towards like you would hire people who are analytical. That's what gave you the competitive advantage. I think it's flipped now to the creative side, because the algorithm is doing a large portion of the work for you from like a data-driven optimization standpoint. You're not really getting people who can beat Facebook's ad serving algorithm, but it's harder to get the creative. Like the creative, you build creative and you put that into Facebook's auction and it serves ads, and people, it resonates with people. They click on it, they don't. Being able to come up with those creative concepts, there's now more of a premium there. So
it's so funny, right? Like everything's going back to old school.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, because it's commoditized. Like the whole ad algorithm is commoditized. You just pay to fucking play. And so the only differentiator now is creative thinking, product design, and creating innovative ways to create experience that people are willing to share, connect to and stuff. And it's like, I feel like it's Ogilvy all over again back in the 1950s or something, 60s.
Yeah. It's interesting. And I think what's like the residual change, like it swung to this analytical side. Now it's coming back to the creative side. But the thing that needs to remain as like the bridge is you're having creative and you're coming up with creative strategies and approaches, but it's still data driven. So you run something, you look at the results, and based off the results, you decide, okay, here's what we should test. Now let's go create some creative concepts around that and structure those creative. So it's like, here's one creative concept. Here's another creative concept. We're testing the creative concepts head to head when we put them back into the ad auction.
And I'd almost say, like, based on what, and I'm just curious what you think, but my experience is, it's that creative is no longer like it used to be in the day. It was like an ad, and it did everything, or like a Super Bowl ad. It's just like one moment. The creative has to be more intelligent now because it's either personalized or series. You're trying to get them to users to move from one point to the other. So the creative needs to bring them along. So the creative has to be a little bit more tiered or something like that. You know what I mean? I don't know how to describe that, but so the creative isn't. It's sort of like data and reactionary and sort of like understanding the journey of whether it's a mobile app or if it's online or what your acquisition. You have to be really intelligent about how you don't want to give it all the way up front. Sometimes you just want to get enough people to get curious. So I think that's what gets me excited, because all this gamification of the algorithm and people who are just going, I'm just going to figure out, like, follow Neil Patel and find out what the next algorithm changes, and you're just going to game the system. You now actually have to add human element to it, and I like that.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, it feels kind of like more human. It's kind of humanizing it back a little bit.
Yeah, and even with Google, like you bring up like Neil Patel, even I think with Google, the algorithm is getting smart enough where it's hard to hack it. So they're rewarding good content. Are you creating good content that satisfies what someone's searching for?
Yeah, and in the end, it's like what resonates with people. What's there's the gaming the system. It's like that. That's why I'm trying to explain to people when I'm talking to about, like, the real marketing now is you really need to lean into who you really are to really resonate with your core audience in a creative way, and but you still need to understand growth. And if you don't understand growth, all you're going to have is great creative. If you don't understand all these other, it's in some ways it's gotten more complex, and in some ways it's actually gotten better, where you can't just hire some kid that just knows the algorithm and you're going to win.
Right.
Right. It's matured.
I think it's if you think about like the different marketing tactics that you have, just even if you separate it into running the ads on some platform, and then you have a whole nother part, which is the CRM, like email marketing, SMS marketing. On the platforms, it's heavily driven by algorithms. They're better than most people. On the CRM side, I think most of it is not driven by algorithms, so there's still opportunity there. And that's where I think there's that data-driven element, is sending someone the right deal at the right time, personalized for them, is what's missing. Like, I think in email and CRM, people are over-indexing to, let's just have a creative concept, rather than coupling that with data and segmentation. So it's interesting. You're seeing these kind of disparities in different parts of the marketing ecosystem.
Yeah, the challenge with creative and personalization, my background has been heavily in personalization. I don't know if you knew that or not. I actually started the Personalization Industry Consortium back in 2001 with Don Peppers and Martha Rogers. I founded it.
Nice.
And it was around ethical information management, helping the businesses self-regulate. We followed with the FTC, and we had some, that back then was DoubleClick and stuff. So I kind of grew up in personalization. I've always loved it. The challenge with personalization has been the creative, because it has to be very modular in order to deliver a personalized experience. And it sort of, it was no sophistication, but now I believe it's evolved. There's a real opportunity to actually be creative with personalization more than ever.
Yeah.
What's your thought on, like, where do you stand on this whole personalization and its capabilities? Because when you mentioned that about being in the right place, right time, personalizing, I'm like, right there is like some pretty magical. If you can pull that stuff off, that's where the magic is in my mind, because you create like massive loyalty, and people, it resonates. People care. They respond what they relate to, right?
Yeah, I think like, let's take like just an e-commerce company. They have a bunch of products, they have a bunch of users, and you could just bucket users into different like product preferences. Like let's just say like Banana Republic, right? Like you have people who like more like dressy clothes, and you have people who like more casual clothes. You have all that data because you have what they purchased, and you actually kind of know how frequently they purchase. So now if you personalize, you can bucket people into, here's the sort of stuff they would like, and here's how often they purchase. And you can use that as like the data and the like analytical framework for first being like, all right, now I'm going to send people at the right time and the right stuff that they want to see. And you can get creative around it. Like, okay, this segment, our hypothesis is that what's going to resonate with them is this type of messaging or this concept or branding it in this way. And because the tools are getting more like automated, you can start doing that for smaller and smaller segments. I think that's where the power really is right now in personalization, is that, marketers and
the data sets don't have to be as big as they used to. The collaborative filtering, like in Amazon back in the day, required a sizable data set to make that one recommendation that you actually cared about. But now you're saying it's like it's micro now, probably, compared to what it used to be.
Yeah. And there's, if you look at a lot of companies, that sophistication, like the journey they go, like they start with is they'll start with, like, even thinking about something like email. At Ease, it was SMSs. We sent a lot of SMSs with different offers. You can start with just simple heuristics, like, hey, we think that we should do this type of sale, like 20% off, and we'll get this many users, 10% off, we'll get this many users, and for these products. So we've created like 5 flavors, 5 types of SMS campaigns we could send. And we test those. And we say, okay, here's the uplift of one. And also here's the cannibalization, because we're giving a discount. So we're going to be losing some profit. And now we know with just those 5 heuristics, we're like, here's how effective each one is. And you can start building those in programmatically. Like, now you have rules. You're saying, okay, when this happens for this type of user, send this deal. And that's like now your baseline thing. It's automated. You don't have someone manually creating campaigns. Then you just create more and more of those, and you can start building data-driven models to send more and more targeted campaigns at the user level. So it's like a progression. You don't have to jump straight to like data-driven machine learning models. You can start with your intuition and come up with simple heuristics on what to serve people at what time, and test those and validate those without machine learning. Machine learning and automation eventually is born out of your learnings.
What about graduating the offer? So so that you initiate the offer like almost in a different way, not just like A/B split or 5 ways of different creative, but almost like testing, how much revenue you can get from somebody, and over time, if they see a message more than once or a different group, that you're not giving away as much money, like the discounting, whatever, right? Like you try to maximize your yield, like you do in a flight, right? Like you have so many people that are willing to pay the discount, but then you have the rest that are, so you just kind of like do some variables with that and test it. I think with programmatic and what you're talking about, this level of sophistication, is it possible to do that? I mean, I think in my brain it makes sense, but I don't know if I've never done it. So
yeah, I'll give you an example at Ease, cannabis delivery startup. We could see, how often like people would purchase, just like broadly in aggregate, right? We would see that, days from last purchase, what percent of people who would buy again. And it turned out by day, I'm just using random days. I don't want to give away their actual days, but let's say day 21, 90% of the people who are ever going to purchase again have already made their purchase. And you can see what the shape of the curve looks like. So in order to not give away a bunch of money to the people who are already going to buy, you can set up your heuristic so that, hey, you only send a discount on day 14 when most of the people who are already going to buy have purchased. And maybe it's a discount for 10%. Well, if they don't buy it on that, then maybe, 3-4 days later, you send them a higher discount. In that way, you're like graduating. Now, the catch there, though, is you want to make sure you don't train users to be expecting and looking for those discounts.
I know, doesn't that always happen? Like when it's like, they have the countdown clock and they're like, okay, I know if I just ignore it, then they're going to email me in 2 days and I'm going to get my 50% off as a last chance or something. Like, so what is your strategy for combating training people to predict this? Is it to be unpredictable? Like, how do you do it?
I mean, one way you can do it is to be unpredictable. That one I haven't figured out yet, but I do think you can build build
Just
some
even being
variability
aware
into
of
it.
it and aware of your patterns is probably the first start of figuring out a way to make sure that you don't train people to wait for discount. You know what I mean? Like, I think
Yeah.
that is, think of how much money is lost in airline and different companies because you've just trained people. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, I know myself, like with Air Canada WestJet in Canada, I just wait for the sale. I'm like, you just trained me to go. I know that at some point in time, I'm going to be able to fly in a range that I want with a flight at a discount. I just have to wait my turn.
Yeah. Or what you can do is you can leverage that training. So as an example for, for delivery, just delivery broadly, not even cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
There are times where the demand is higher, and at those times, delivery times increase. Like in the evening when people want to eat, it's more expensive to deliver the food. The experience is worse because people have to wait longer, and drivers are sitting in traffic. Now, if you want to train your users to give them more of a discount for ordering earlier, like that's kind of a win-win, because you'll get more utilization of your driver fleet that might just be sitting around during that time, and the delivery's faster, so the cost per delivery is lower, and so it makes sense to give away that discount and train a lot of users to order earlier than they would. Like that's one way to use it to your advantage.
What if here's this is a totally radical idea, and I think it's a born out of, I did a thing with Don Peppers on trust and the fact that Apple builds incredible trust because it doesn't like if you've already bought a movie, it'll go, are you sure you want to buy this because you've already bought it? Where they could
Yeah.
easily have got me so many times going, oh yeah, I bought Gladiator again. Oh fuck, and they got me, and they got my money, and they'd be well within the right to do it, but they create transparency and the radical trust is created. And I'm like, I know that I can just order without will. I wonder if there would be a really good strategy to go train your users to just pay full price, right? And know that if there was a discount, a significant one, that you would just rebate them. And I don't think any CMO in their mind would be like, what are we doing? But if they thought about, and it kind of leans into this little word of mouth thing, is, you would create maybe some loyalty, or people would just trust, like that in the product design, you're just going, I just want to make sure I get a seat. And if it ends up coming on sale, because, and if it sells out, then there was no discount, then it didn't happen, and it wouldn't have happened anyways. But if it does, then at least I know I benefit from being early. That would be a really radical idea. I don't know what you think of that. I don't know if the math actually works, but in my mind, I'm like, that would create word of mouth.
Yeah. I think some people see Amazon as that. Like a lot of people start their shopping destination at Amazon, their e-commerce experience at Amazon. They don't go to Google and search for something first. They just go to Amazon and search for it. And they buy it because a lot of people assume that the cheapest price is going to be on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
So they've leaned into that. They've built their business around that, of being the lowest price player. And so people have.
But the thing with that is that that's a race to the bottom. So they're already baking in, trying to be the low cost, like a Walmart. What I'm saying is being a premium. And if you're the one that played the premium, and if there was a discount, just because you were first, you're not the dummy. See, that's the thing that what people don't want. Like nowadays, with consumers have so much control of their data, so much control over finding stuff, that they're gaming the system as best they can. You're trained to do it. You could train people to go, don't care, I'm going to do it. And if it comes up, I get a discount. I don't know. Maybe I'm being really radical with that.
I think it's interesting that you brought up the premium category, because the premium category, right? Like, there's perceived value in the price. The higher price, there's actually derives perceived value for the people. So sometimes the sales it's kind of flies in the face of the business model in general. But what you've actually seen simultaneously is now people, like consumers, have shifted to, even in premium stuff, they want deals, right? Which is why Nordstrom, for a long time, the segment of Nordstrom that was growing was Nordstrom Rack. It wasn't a Nordstrom business. They were like shutting down Nordstrom retail locations, but expanding Nordstrom Rack. Like everyone is kind of looking for a deal these days. It's like now just part of user behavior. So yeah, I think if you can get people to trust that, you're getting it at the right, whenever you buy, you're getting like the best price, or like a lower price than the price that's going to be lower if you were to wait is not that meaningful. Then yeah, I think you've surpassed that hurdle. And I don't know anyone else who's doing that at the premium
Nobody's
level.
doing it that I know of, but I'm just saying, like, imagine, well, maybe somebody is, but imagine you woke up in the morning and you bought your flight to Hawaii. You told me you're going to Hawaii, and they go, hey, we're going to give you a $200 discount back. We're going to give you a rebate because it went on sale and we wanted to make sure that you didn't feel, like a dummy for getting it early. What would that do to you?
That would be amazing. I think that would drive a lot of word of mouth.
That would drive a lot of word of mouth. I think the trust, because I'm writing about my book about this, and I just feel that, and that's why I like the word of mouth discussion, is because I believe we're leaving this age of attention where you could game the system, and if you just get someone's attention, you're going to be able to convince them, clickbait or whatever, to get them to get through the funnel and make your numbers, right? And I believe we've left this age of attention. We moved into this age of trust where people mistrust everything. I don't like to watch a movie unless I see my IMDb score, or they're looking for whether it's your time, your money, you're looking for reviews. Like, is this restaurant going to be really good? And even the reviews now, you don't even trust so much. You're like, oh, they probably gamed the system for reviews. Like, people say they're an Amazon bestseller, and I'm like, yeah, did you game that, or are you really a bestseller? I don't know anymore. Like, I actually have a level of mistrust. So the word of mouth thing is perfectly timed. It's old school, but it's new school all over again, because it's about trust, and it's elemental. And the fact that we're going to go into that calculating, because I want to make sure we have enough time to go into this, because we didn't even get into this yet. But what's your thoughts in and around that sort of shift, and maybe tell us a little bit about what got you into word of mouth?
Yeah. So which one of those do you want me to answer first?
I don't know. I know I kind of ranted there a little bit, but it's like, well, I guess the first thing is, your thoughts around just, this whole shift towards trust.
Yeah.
Is number one. And then two, what's the connection now with, like, what happened that got you into this word of mouth and then led to this whole thing?
Yeah. I think there's a huge thing. Like, what you're saying resonates with me completely around trust, because nowadays people can't trust anything. People can't trust facts on the news. Everyone has their own set of facts. So hearing it from other people, hearing your facts from people you trust, those are the actual facts. Hearing it from your trusted news source, those are your facts, right? Everything has become like, there's just this deficit of trust in so many things. So I do believe that there's something there. What has gotten me into word of mouth? I really I want to come back to your other point, because I think there actually is a strong connection between trust and word of mouth. But the short answer of what got me into word of mouth was a few things. Was I saw that this sort of hackiness, these channels, they're becoming more competitive. Everyone was figuring out how to do it, and like the amount of time where you could have this competitive advantage was going down. Two, word of mouth is the one thing that it seems like it's unmeasurable, and people are not paying attention to it because it's not measurable. And growth's sort of underlying DNA is they're analytical. They measurement is a prerequisite. So if I could take this big opportunity that no one's touching and bring measurement to it, and when I say me, there was a lot of other people involved. But if we can do that, then you kind of opened up this new venue that is both going to be meaningful and drive value for an organization, a product, whatever you're working on. But just as importantly, is going to be intellectually exciting and interesting. Like, for a lot of growth people, you're always looking for, like, how do you crack this nut, this new problem? And that's what got me interested in it.
It was a challenge. It's like, because when I literally was going, someone's come up with a coefficient to calculate word of mouth. I'm like, holy shit. I'm like, is this real? And, because there's lots of things, there are ways, tracking word of mouth, but it usually requires you to have explicit information, meaning someone tells you that source, right? Oh, I learned from a friend. So, there is, to be fair to everyone that's listening, there is ways to do it, but that's not effective because most people forget, some people lie, and it's hard to get that information. So how can you possibly forecast it? So go on, tell me about, just how did you, like, the fact that you decided to crack this is interesting, but how did you figure this out?
Yeah. So I think there's been two use cases during this journey. So the first one was at Zynga. Mm-hmm. And at Zynga actually, had made this transition from dominating Facebook and people's time on desktop to now being in this mobile arena, right? Mobile apps. They're a mobile app first company. And there was a lot of paid acquisition. You could track all sources really, really well. And one of the things I did when I went there was we built this model. I was in charge of building this growth model so that we could say, here are the inputs. Now we know for the 12, 24 months of a game, here's what the user growth is going to be, the revenue, et cetera. And we can make decisions. Do we want to launch this game or do we want to go back and fine tune it? I realized there that even though it was so heavily driven by paid acquisition, still the big gap, like 50% of all of the users being acquired coming from word of mouth. And so it was this big gap in my model. And that's where Tomas and I started talking. And, he had started actually looking at this before even I did. And we're like, okay, let's go a little bit deeper. We created this model this metric in order to plug the gap in that model. So that was why we initially did it. We rolled it out at Zynga. All the game studios started using it. It became like something we tracked that was really core at Zynga. Now, like fast forward, that was 2014. Fast forward now, what got me thinking about it again was, I've been working with some ed tech companies, and I realized after talking to a number of teachers, so this is a free product targeting teachers. Teachers use it to improve the classroom experience and also to get parents involved. I realized that teachers, when you talk to them, and I think I talked to like 15 of them, the way that they share products is two ways. In a staff meeting, they'll talk about it, or they'll go to another teacher's classroom and tell them about it. So all of this is happening offline, not through viral flows, none of that. And then a lot of these companies also, this company had zero paid acquisition. So all of the growth was viral. All of the viral growth was word of mouth, and nothing else was happening. So I said, this is a great use case to start looking at word of mouth again, because it's simple. There's not that many other things. Mm-hmm. So I partnered with another ed tech company, and we did it for them. They were kind of perfect use case as well. Their only real channel was product-driven growth. It was search engine optimization. And that's one where we could piece it out, pull out the search engine portion of it and attribute pretty well the rest to word of mouth.
And have you been able to duplicate it outside of a very simplistic word of mouth model where there was like the combination of paid, multiple channels, and then able to isolate the word of mouth and be able to duplicate?
Yeah. So the very first one, Zynga, was exactly that. It was heavily reliant on paid. Then I'm like, let's look outside mobile gaming and look at a bunch of industries. And we saw it work definitively for ones where it was more simple use cases, like still massive companies. Like these are, $1 billion plus companies, but the number of channels they use was pretty small. Then we looked at ones in between that, that were outside mobile gaming, did pay, were at different stages of, their life, their growth of a company. And we saw it apply to a lot of them. So that's kind of why we built on it further and released that article. Now, the second article kind of goes into when it doesn't work as well, where the more complicated your marketing mix gets, the more variables, the more noisy it is. And so at a certain point, when you're a really large company with a ton of stuff going on, you have to get into econometrics modeling. And that's what myself and Taylor, who we co-authored this article, are looking at.
Interesting. So anyone that's listening, this is no small thing, because it's not just about like reporting, it's about what levers actually you can do to actually incentivize and do more of it. Because I just think of how many times somebody in one department of marketing got credit for the growth, but it was really word of mouth. It was something else. And it was really the quality of the product, or it was really something else, or a community that it was really resonating with, and it just was multiplying and growing. Like these are the kind of things, insights that I think have been completely left in the dark, and it's just been kind of lumped in, so everybody benefited from those metrics. And now, more than with this age of trust, actually architecting and measuring this piece of word of mouth, my gosh, I mean, it's like when I read this, I was like, I didn't believe it. It's like I read it like 5 times. I was like, this is probably one of the most important pieces in marketing I've read. I'm gonna be honest with you, in the last 5 years. It's that
I'm really
fucking
glad to
good.
hear
And
that.
I'm like, I'm not overblowing it. I think you're onto an incredible career trajectory, because this is I'm sure there's other examples of people that have tried to explain this or outline this, but I've never seen nothing at this scale where, from a growth marketer standpoint, I've seen it from other disciplines and different types, but I'm a growth marketer at heart. So I look kind of like this art and science and all the things that you've done to go, how can we actually like experiment to get there? You've just given on a platter to people who are art, science, and can kind of focus on a completely different genre of marketing. It's like fascinating. So can you walk someone through just at a high level, explain it, just so that someone that's listening, they maybe they could read in detail, but can you just describe it in some level of detail?
Yeah. So I'm going to do my best here.
Okay.
But what we are trying to do is we are trying to create a metric that predicts word of mouth organic users, right? Like that's fundamentally the problem. Organic word of mouth users makes up at least 50% of your acquisition, but it's sort of hand wavy the way people forecast it in. So we looked at like, all right, what are ways to predict word of mouth? Well, what drives word of mouth? And, it's the people who use your product, right? The people who don't use your product or stopped using your product are less likely to be talking about it. The ones who are actively using it are. So we tried to create a metric using retention or active users to predict word of mouth. That was sort of the hypothesis. And we did that. And so we would say, okay, let's have a numerator, which is what we're trying to predict, and a denominator, which is what we're using to predict it. So the numerator was simply word of mouth users, organic word of mouth users. And the denominator was active users. And active users, there's 2 types of active users: returning users, as well as new paid users, right? We still consider a paid user an active user, but we just lump them in into the bottom, because it's basically word of mouth users and everyone else as the denominator. So everyone who's active minus word of mouth users predicts word of mouth users. We did that and we tested it. We used some statistical analyses and saw that there was strong correlation, i.e., it was a reliable metric. It was very predictive. Does that make sense?
It does. And say you're not a software company and you don't have like your frequency of returning users is like a retail store or something like that. Can this still be applied in when you kind of move outside of that sort of frequent software log in, log out type of environment?
I'd say the limitations of this, it's harder for things that have really long sales cycles or are really big purchases. So big enterprise software, Oracle, like this isn't going to work, right?
And you also have multi-stakeholder decision makers in that situation. So is it fair to say that single purchase, single user purchase is probably, if you have people in a household that are multiple decision makers, like it's because you like who's actually making the purchase. Like what would be some of the core variables that, because I feel like this is only the beginning, because it's possible you may be able to move in that direction much more if there was some way of identification. I think that would probably be the only thing, right?
Yes.
If you identify the source and if you can just do that identification, you still can do forecasting.
Exactly. It's identifying or attributing, and then like what is the action, right? So what defines an active user? So like Peloton example is mostly an offline product, but they have people taking like classes and videos. Like that's a great one where you're coupling them using the product.
Engaging with the product.
Yeah. And you can happen to measure that because, right, they're doing, they're doing a session, following along with someone, right? And that's measured. They're There probably are other ways to do it, I think, on the offline world. But the crux of this is you have to be able to measure active users and some like you need to have some measure of active user and attribution too, so you can split out like new users and the segment that are word of mouth or the segment that are just not trackable, which is what we're considering word of mouth.
So with someone with a points card or membership, they would qualify because you'd be able to track the repeat purchases, right?
Yep. That's exactly right.
So because the rise of the subscription model is really interesting. It's definitely from a growth standpoint. I love the model. It's like your acquisition on an acquisition treadmill for one. And I'm looking at a lot of businesses now, what helping them, and I'm like trying to figure out like this. How can we accelerate word of mouth, and how can we attribute it to word of mouth so that we can divert funds that are over here into activities that are more that foster that sort of word of mouth, if you will, because that's been one of the challenges is he who can measure usually gets more money.
Yeah.
Really. And this is what this is doing. This is actually allowing more funds to go in this direction. What advice do you have for somebody that's going, okay, I want to move in this direction. What are the things that I can do to either prepare myself or to help myself so that I can actually measure this?
I would say there's a good chance you can already do the simple analysis. Active users and new users are typical things that most software businesses track, right? Like tracking is a big issue with a lot of companies, but those are two things that are typically the most accurate. So start with the simple analysis. You can find all of it in the second article. You can download the templates, and especially if you have Google Analytics, it'll be very plug and play. Do the simple analysis. See if there is a strong correlation using the stat tool we provided. And if there is, you can already start drawing insights from it. And then once you have that, you can start looking at your historical data. Once you're like, okay, we've calculated this metric, it seems to have a high, strong correlation. Look historically and see, were there instances where word of mouth increased? And then start talking about like what happened back there. So the past will inform, your hypotheses for what to do, and you can measure it. So those are really the two ingredients you need.
What if you actually, I was just thinking then, because this is tracking to a sale, right? So you're tracking word of mouth to sale. But what if, like in retail, you can't identify the individual in sale specifically, and repeat purchases are a little bit further apart. What if you applied the same analysis to social, and that a certain percentage of social moves to it turns into acquisition, but you're still measuring word of mouth, but it's not necessarily word of mouth to the close. It's word of mouth to get to this next stage in the funnel, if you will, right? So it's still an potentially important calculation, because that might be. Sorry, my dogs have Tourette's, so they might bark once in a while. What do you think of that? Like, is that possible with your model?
It's completely possible, and I highly recommend it. As long as you can track it, you can put it in the denominator. Mm-hmm. Again, this entire thing comes down to a framework of use X to predict Y. Y is word of mouth users or new organic users, and X can be whatever you want, right? It can be the number of like social posts. You can do social posts and purchases, like all that stuff. You can lump it together, piece it out, do it separately, and see, is there a strong correlation, right? And if there is, then it's off to the races.
Totally.
And I do think there's something really big around community. Products that have community and you can track the activities of community, I think those are really the biggest drivers of word of mouth. And that's informed from ed tech and the dynamics I've seen among teachers. Like there are some products that teachers just love. They're really passionate about it. If your product has high NPS and or it has community, there's a good chance that word like this is a great fit for your business and something you can influence and something you're already doing things that are driving word of mouth. Now it's just like putting that lens towards it and looking at it from a data perspective, which is kind of, that's the growth process. That's like if you abstract it and you're saying like, all right, no more hacks. We're not looking at something that's been commoditized like paid user acquisition. Fundamentally, it's let's use data and use that to build a framework for either designing product or marketing initiatives.
Amazing.
And for me, this is just the next stage of that.
We literally could go on for another hour and do a deeper dive, but we're bumping up to an hour. The last question I have for you is, what's the future of word of mouth, and from your perspective, where do you see the future of growth and word of mouth, or both?
Well, as it comes to specifically this thing we've created, is what I'd love to see is it kind of being disseminated more broadly like NPS has. So I started my career at Bain, and Bain created NPS. They gave it away for free, and it turned into the thing that is now like really commonplace. I would love, and we'll see if it happens, I would love for this to be the same thing. So if people are working on this, please reach out to me. I'm happy to give input. I'm doing some workshops with other companies on it. And that's where I think it can go. I think if people can get to some very specific concrete examples that they end up A/B testing, that validates, okay, we use word of mouth to actually improve acquisition, like viral acquisition, then it'll really like catch hold.
Awesome. And maybe we'll have to calculate the word of mouth coefficient. Hate to get a little better there. I'll definitely blow this up and share it as many people as I possibly can. I don't think we've heard this is just the tipping point, I think, of you exploring this, because it gives more people test this, try this. I think you're gonna get more feedback, and maybe even create like a little bit of a community around this coefficient. Anything I can do to help, but it's absolutely fantastic. Like, thank you so much for doing this. This is was like warms my heart that someone's actually thinking the same way I do about growth, and I just think that this is just the beginning. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I definitely want to recognize the other people involved in this. So Tomas Puello, who had Zynga, like we were initially started with a conversation with him. And then Michael Taylor, who's the co-founder of Ladder, who helped me as we looked at it for other industries. And then also Phil Carter, who is the director of growth at
Quizlet?
Quizlet, yes, that's right, which is now $1 billion ed tech company.
Huge. So if you send me their contact information, I'm going to make sure they're in the show notes. They all deserve credits if you guys are listening. Good work. Like I'm your biggest fan right now. And where can people follow you, and where can they get the word of mouth coefficient?
So I've created a Substack account because, again, this was my first article. Now we have 2, and subscribe to that. And you'll be getting kind of all the writing around word of mouth, as well as some other stuff. And feel free to add or follow me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active. Not huge on Twitter, might be, but if you want to follow me, those are the 2 sources. Awesome.
Well, thank you again for being on the show. This was illuminating and exciting. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Well, thank you. That's another episode of the Groundswell Marketing Podcast. And as always, hit the mic on groundswell.fm. Leave me a voicemail. Tell me what you think of the word of mouth coefficient, and where you think, maybe if you have some ideas on where word of mouth is going. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And if you want to throw some questions up for Yousuf, I'll pass them on to him as well. So until the next episode, mahalo.
Thank you.